My name is Elias Vance. It feels somewhat strange to commit that to writing, even in a private log such as this, given the circumstances that now govern my days, and more pressingly, my nights. Professionally, my specialization lies in complex data pattern recognition. It's a rather niche field, involving the sifting of vast, seemingly unrelated datasets to find subtle correlations, predictive indicators, or anomalous outliers that might escape conventional analysis. A skill, I was surprised to learn, that was in high demand for this unique posting. The offer itself was, to put it mildly, too substantial to ignore. It arrived through channels I can only describe as discreet, following a period of professional uncertainty after the downsizing. At my previous engagement at the university's astrophysics department, there my work involved charting cosmic background radiation, looking for patterns that might hint at the universe's earliest moments. Here, I wasn't entirely sure what patterns I'd be looking for, but the remuneration suggested they were of significant importance. The need for a fresh start, coupled with a financial situation that was rapidly becoming untenable, made the decision, if not easy, then necessary. I signed the non-disclosure agreements, packed a single suitcase as instructed, and prepared myself for a new chapter, cloaked in government secrecy, and, as I would soon discover, a pervasive sense of the peculiar. The journey to the facility was an exercise in orchestrated anonymity. It began with a nondescript black, collecting me from a pre-arranged, equally nondescript location in a quiet suburb of Las Vegas. The windows were tinted to an almost opaque black, affording me only fleeting glimpses of the neon-drenched city receding in the distance before we hit the open highway. After an hour, the sedan pulled into a featureless hangar at a private airfield. There were no logos, no identifying markers, just the hum of unseen machinery and the arid Nevada wind whipping dust across the tarmac. I was transferred to a small, windowless passenger jet. My two escorts, men in dark, unadorned suits who had introduced themselves only as Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith, a cliché that did little to inspire confidence, were polite but utterly uncommunicative. The flight itself was short, perhaps 45 minutes, though without windows, my sense of time and direction quickly became distorted. Upon landing, on what felt like an equally remote and unmarked airstrip, I was guided into another black vehicle, this one a robust SUV. This time even the drivers, compressor separated by a darkened partition. The drive that followed was long and increasingly desolate. Through the windshield, I could see the landscape transform from scrubland to true barren desert. Jagged sun-baked mountains rose in the distance, their peaks shimmering under the oppressive midday heat. We passed through no towns, saw no other vehicles. The only signs of human passage were the increasingly frequent security checkpoints. The first was a simple gate with a board, "Looking guard." The next involved a more thorough vehicle search and a check of my pre-supplied credentials. The third, set deep within a canyon, was a formidable affair with armed personnel, concrete barriers, and what looked like automated weapon emplacements. Each checkpoint served as a stark reminder that I was entering a place deliberately cut off from the world, a place that valued its isolation above all else. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the facility itself came into view. It was not what I had expected. There were no gleaming towers or futuristic architecture. Instead, nestled at the base of a stark, flat-top mesa, was a sprawling complex of low, windowless buildings. They were constructed from a dull, gray material that seemed to absorb the harsh desert light, giving the entire place a strangely muted, almost two-dimensional appearance. The perimeter was marked by an unnervingly high tech fence, topped with coils of razor wire and what looked like sophisticated sensor arrays. There was an air of profound stillness about the place. The only sound the distant, almost subliminal hum of what I assumed was a massive power generator or ventilation system. The heat was a physical presence, pressing down, and the air carried a faint, sterile, metallic tang. My initial processing was as impersonal as the journey. I was led through a series of stark, white corridors by a new escort, a woman with a severe haircut and an equally severe expression, who introduced herself as Ms. Albright, head of personnel integration. My single suitcase was taken, its contents presumably to be scrutinized. I was photographed, fingerprinted, and subjected to a retinal scan. The silence of the place was unnerving, broken only by the click of M's. Albright's heels on the polished concrete floor, and the quiet hiss of automated doors. The few other personnel I glimpsed in the corridors moved with a quiet efficiency, their faces carefully neutral, their eyes rarely meeting mine. There was a pervasive sense of watchfulness, as if the walls themselves were observing. The final stage of my induction was the orientation briefing, held in a small, windowless room furnished only with a table and 2 chairs. Ms. Albright sat opposite me, a thin file folder open before her. Her voice was a monotone, devoid of inflection, as she outlined the general terms of my employment, most of which I already knew. Then, she slid a laminated card across the table. "These are the initial operational protocols, Mr. Vance," she stated, her gaze unwavering. "Commit them to memory. Adherence is not optional. It is mandatory. The consequences for non-compliance are significant." I picked up the card. The heading read, "Facility Orientation Rules, Initial Set." Rule number, Directive 1, all personal electronic devices must be surrendered upon entry. No exceptions. Facility-issued devices only. 3 Corridor 7, Gamma is to be avoided between the hours of 0200 and 0400. No reason will be provided. 5. If you observe Feckering in the Sector B overhead lights, do not make eye contact with your reflection in any polished surface for at least 10 minutes. 8. All food and drink must be consumed in designated mess halls. Never leave organic matter unattended in workspaces. ROC2. Until I read them again. Rule 1 seems standard for a high-security environment. Rule 8, while a little specific about organic matter, could be construed as a hygiene protocol. But Rules 3 and 5, they sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the facility's efficient air conditioning. Avoid a corridor during specific hours, with no reason given. Avoid eye contact with reflections if the lights flickered. This was beyond any standard security or safety procedure I had ever encountered. The bureaucratic matter of fact presentation of these utterly bizarre instructions was perhaps the most unsettling part. It implied that these were not suggestions, not quirks, but established, necessary components of existing here. The very structure of the rules, presented so formally, created a jarring contrast with their irrational content. A contrast that hinted at an underlying reality, far stranger than I had prepared myself for. Are there clarifications available for these? I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Ms. Albright's expression did not change. The protocols are self-explanatory, Mr. Vance. Understanding their necessity is not a prerequisite for compliance. Her tone left no room for further questions. The clear implication was that the system here was absolute, and my role was to fit within it, not to question its foundations. My first few days were a blur of settling into my small, functional living quarters and familiarizing myself with the equally functional, though far more complex, data systems I was assigned to. The work itself was intriguing. In a detached sort of way, analyzing atmospheric particulate data, seismic readings from deep within the Earth, and complex energy signatures of unknown origin. But always at the back of my mind were the rules. The first incident occurred on my third night. I was working late in my assigned lab module, trying to get a handle on a particularly dense dataset. My workstation was located at the end of a long corridor, not far from an intersection. Lost in thought, I pushed back my chair, intending to stretch my legs and perhaps find a water fountain. I glanced at my facility, issued chronometer 01:52. I vaguely recalled Corridor 7, Gamma being somewhere to my left. As I stepped out of my lab, I turned left, taking a few absent-minded steps down the intersecting hallway. A figure materialized from the shadows further down, a security guard, moving with an unnerving silence. He was tall and bulky, his features obscured by the dim lighting, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. Even from a distance, they seemed to reflect the minimal light with an unnatural intensity, almost like an animal's. He didn't speak, didn't raise a hand. He simply stood there, blocking my path, a silent, imposing sentinel. A sudden, cold realization washed over me. This was Corridor 7 Gamma, and the time was rapidly approaching 0200. I stopped abruptly. The guard remained motionless. I could feel a prickle of sweat on my forehead. My apologies, I mumbled, my voice sounding louder than intended in the oppressive silence. Wrong turn. He didn't respond, didn't even nod. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction, the weight of his unseen gaze pressing into my back. It was a minor thing, easily dismissed as an overzealous guard or my own jumpiness in a new, strange environment. But the intensity of his stillness, the subtle wrongness in his eyes, lingered with me. It was the first concrete sign that the rules were not just words on a laminated card. They were threads in the fabric of this place, and to pull on them, even accidentally, was to invite a response. The seed of doubt, planted during Ms. Albright's briefing, had begun to sprout. This place was not just secret, it was fundamentally, deeply wrong. The weeks that followed my near transgression in corridor 7, Gamma settled into a strange, disquieting rhythm. Life within the facility was a study in controlled monotony. The recycled air always hummed at the same low frequency. The artificial lights maintained a constant, shadowless illumination, and the meals in the designated mess hall, bland, nutritious, and invariably punctual, were consumed in a near universal silence. My colleagues, a collection of brilliant but deeply insular individuals, were not unfriendly, merely distant. Conversations rarely strayed beyond the immediate demands of our work. Personal histories, hobbies, even opinions on the weather sim, which we never experienced directly, were topics left unexplored, as if by unspoken agreement. We were cogs in a machine whose overall design remained opaque, and it seemed everyone preferred it that way, or had at least learned to feign preference. My work continued to be a dive into the esoteric. The data sets grew more complex, the patterns more elusive, and, at times, more disturbing. I was sifting through telemetry from what were described as deep, bore atmospheric sensors, but the readings often resembled biological signatures more than meteorological phenomena. Fluctuations in subterranean magnetic fields that correlated with local wildlife disappearances. Strange, rhythmic pulses of energy emanating from beneath the facility itself, pulses that the official documentation studiously ignored. I flagged these anomalies, submitted my reports through the secure internal network, and received only terse acknowledgments in return. No questions, no requests for elaboration. Just the silent ingestion of data into the facility's vast, unseen maw. The rules, however, never receded into the background. They were a constant, low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface of daily routine. One afternoon, while working in Sector B, a wing primarily dedicated to materials analysis, judging by the equipment, I occasionally glimpsed through open lab doors. The overhead lights began to flicker. It wasn't a dramatic power failure type of flicker, but a subtle, almost nauseating pulse, like a failing fluorescent tube. Immediately I remembered Rule 5V: if you observe flickering in the Sector B overhead lights, do not make eye contact with your reflection in any polished surface for at least 10 minutes. My workstation monitor, currently displaying a complex waveform analysis, was a sleek black, reflective surface. The polished chrome trim on the desk, the darkened glass of a nearby instrument panel. Suddenly, the lab seemed full of treacherous mirrors. I froze, my gaze fixed on a non-reflective patch of wall. The flickering continued, a sickly yellow, green throb. I could feel my heart rate increase. The urge to glance at my screen, to see if the data stream was affected, was almost overwhelming. But Ms. Albright's voice, flat and devoid of emotion, echoed in my memory. Adherence is not optional. I counted the seconds, then minutes, my eyes darting around the room, carefully avoiding any surface that might betray my own image. Other personnel in the lab, I noticed, were doing the same. A woman across the aisle had her head bowed, staring intently at her lap. A man near the door was examining the scuffs of his shoes with an almost religious focus. No one spoke. No one acknowledged the flickering lights or the collective, silent adherence to the unseen protocol. The air was thick with a shared, unspoken tension. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to the prescribed 10 minutes, the flickering stopped. The lights returned to their steady, sterile glow. Slowly, cautiously, people resumed their work. The incident was never mentioned. It was as if it hadn't happened. But the image of my colleagues, all studiously avoiding their own reflections, was seared into my mind. What were we afraid of seeing? Rule 8, regarding organic matter, also had its unsettling manifestations. Never leave organic matter unattended in workspaces. It sounded like a simple hygiene rule, but its enforcement was anything but. I once saw a senior researcher, a Dr. Eris Thorne, a man known for his meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail, accidentally leave half an apple on his workbench when called away for an urgent consultation. He was gone for no more than 5 minutes. When he returned, the apple was gone. Not eaten, not thrown away. Simply gone. Thorne's face, normally a mask of academic composure, went pale. He didn't search for it. He didn't ask if anyone had seen it. He just stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space on his bench, then meticulously wiped the area with a disinfectant cloth from a wall-mounted dispenser, his movements stiff and precise. Later that day, I saw him being escorted by 2 security personnel towards Ms. Albright's office. He looked shaken. I never saw Dr. Thorne in the mess hall or the labs again. His workstation was cleared out by the next morning, his projects silently reassigned. The swiftness and silence of his disappearance were more chilling than any overt punishment could have been. New rules would occasionally appear, deliver via the internal messaging system, always brief, always without explanation. One morning, a new directive was added to our individual access cards. Rule 11T. If you hear humming or whispered vocalizations from ventilation shafts, do not acknowledge them. Increase ambient noise levels in your immediate vicinity if possible, e.g., activate non-essential equipment. The casual mention of whispered vocalizations was profoundly disturbing. Were they auditory hallucinations? A known side effect of something in the recycled air? Or something else? The ambiguity was a form of psychological torture. The isolation began to wear on me. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the shift changes and the sterile routine. The lack of genuine human connection. The constant vigilance required to navigate the rules. The unsettling nature of my work, it all conspired to create a pervasive sense of unease. I started to notice things, or perhaps imagine them. The way shadows seemed to linger a moment, too long in the corners of my vision. A faint, almost inaudible skittering sound from within the walls of my quarters at night. The feeling of being watched, even when I was alone. Was it paranoia, brought by the oppressive atmosphere? Or was the facility itself starting to seep into my consciousness? One evening, I was reviewing a particularly troubling data set. It involved a series of deep space translations that the facility had apparently been monitoring for years. The patterns were complex, almost mathematical, but interspersed within them were sequences that felt organic, like a language, but one so alien, so utterly outside human comprehension, that it induced a profound sense of vertigo just to contemplate it. As I leaned closer to the screen, trying to isolate a recurring motif, my facility issued chronometer beeped softly 01:58. I was working late again. Suddenly, a low, resonant hum vibrated through the floor, through the desk, into my very bones. It wasn't the usual thrum of the facility's machinery. This was deeper, more powerful, and it carried a strange, discordant undertone. The lights in my lab flickered violently, then dimmed to a sickly orange glow. My monitor went blank, then flashed with a cascade of cryptic symbols I didn't recognize from any known language or coding system. And then I heard it. From the main ventilation shaft above my workstation, a sound that was not mechanical. It was a soft, wet, dragging noise, accompanied by a series of faint, almost plaintive whispers. The words were indistinct, a sibilant chorus, just beyond the threshold of understanding, but the intent behind them felt palpable. A cold, curious pressure against my mind. Rule 11 slammed into my thoughts. If you hear humming or whispered vocalizations from ventilation shafts, do not acknowledge them. Increase ambient noise levels. My hands trembled as I reached for the control panel of a nearby spectral analyzer, a piece of equipment I rarely used but which, when active, emitted a significant amount of white noise. I fumbled with the switch, my fingers slick with sweat. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. The whispers seemed to coalesce, to focus. I could feel a cold draft emanating from the vent, carrying with it a faint, charnel odor, like damp earth and something else, something metallic and sweet. With a click, the analyzer whirred to life, its fans kicking in, filling the small lab with a rushing broad spectrum hum. The whispers faltered, seemed to recede, drowned out by the mundane noise of the machine. The dragging sound faded. The lights flickered again, then returned to their normal, steady intensity. My monitor rebooted, displaying the standard login screen. The deep, resonant hum from beneath the floor subsided. I sat there for a long time, shaking, the roar of the analyzer a comforting blanket. I didn't turn it off until the first hint of the scheduled day cycle, when the corridor lights brightened marginally. The incident was another stark reminder. The rules were not arbitrary. They were a shield, a set of desperate instructions for surviving in a place where the laws of nature, as I understood them, seemed to be selectively enforced, and where something ancient, something alien, whispered from the vents and pulsed beneath the sterile floors. The facility wasn't just researching the unknown. It was built on top of it, or perhaps within it. And we, the inhabitants, were living on the very precipice of its awareness. The incident with the whispers in the vent left an indelible mark. Sleep became a shallow, restless affair, punctuated by the imagined sound of dragging from within the walls of my quarters. My focus during work hours, once sharp and analytical, was now frayed, prone to distraction. I found myself jumping at unexpected noises, scrutinizing shadows, and reading the laminated rules card with an almost obsessive frequency, as if new, more terrible directives might spontaneously materialize on its surface. The facility, which had initially felt merely strange and secretive, now felt actively hostile, a place of lurking, unseen malevolence. My attempts to find patterns in the rules themselves, to apply my analytical skills to the very framework of my confinement, yielded little. There was no discernible logic, no common thread that could explain their bizarre nature. Some seemed to relate to specific times or locations, others to sensory input, and a few, like the infamous Rule 8 about organic matter, to almost ritualistic behaviors. It was as if they were designed not by a rational mind, but by a committee of madmen, each contributing their own particular brand of paranoia. Or perhaps, and this thought was far more chilling, they were reactions to phenomena so alien that human logic simply couldn't encompass them. One day, a new rule appeared on our internal terminals, stark and unambiguous. Rule 4.2a. Under no circumstances are personnel to attempt access to files or archives designated level Omega redaction. Attempts to bypass security protocols will be met with immediate and permanent reassignment. Permanent reassignment. The euphemism was chillingly familiar, a direct echo of what had happened to Dr. Thorne. This new rule, unlike some of the more esoteric ones, felt targeted, a direct warning against curiosity. And, of course, it had the immediate effect of making me intensely curious about what a level Omega redaction file might contain. My work involved sifting through vast amounts of data. The system architecture was something I was becoming increasingly familiar with. The temptation to probe, to just look, was a dangerous itch. It was during a routine data sweep, analyzing cross-correlations between deep-level seismic activity and unusual atmospheric energy fluctuations, that I stumbled upon it. A data packet, flagged with a string of security protocols I'd never encountered before, and nested deep within a server directory that was by all rights supposed to be empty. Its designation, Omega Report 734. My blood ran cold. This had to be it. Rule 14 flashed in my mind, a neon warning sign. But the file was there, tantalizingly close, a digital ghost in the machine. My training, my very nature as an analyst, screamed at me to investigate. The potential consequences, however, were equally loud. I hesitated for a long moment, my cursor hovering over the file name. The logical part of my brain urged caution, retreat. But another part, a reckless, desperate part, fueled by months of suppressed questions and mounting dread, urged me forward. With a deep breath, I initiated a low-level access query, not attempting to open the file directly, but to retrieve its metadata, creation date, file size, last access. Benign, standard diagnostic commands. The system responded, but not in the way I expected. Instead of the requested information, my screen filled with a burst of visual static, a chaotic, pixelated snowstorm. Simultaneously, a harsh, grating noise erupted from my workstation speakers, not clean white noise of the spectral analyzer, but a raw, tearing sound, like fabric being ripped apart, or 1,000 voices screaming in unison. filtered through a broken microphone. The sound was agonizing, physically painful. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it seemed to resonate directly within my skull. The static on the screen pulsed in time with the noise, and for a horrifying instant, I thought I saw shapes within the chaos, distorted, elongated faces, mouths agape in silent screams, eyes like burning coals. The air in my lab grew frigid, and the metallic tang I sometimes noticed in the facility's atmosphere intensified, becoming acrid and coppery, like old blood. Panic seized me. I slammed the emergency power off button on my console. The screen went black. The terrible noise cut off abruptly, plunging the lab into an unnerving silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the frantic thumping of my heart. I sat there, trembling, for several minutes, expecting security to burst through the door at any moment. But nothing happened. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Slowly, cautiously, I rebooted my system. It came back online normally. No trace of the static, no error messages. The Omega Rapa Art 734 Final Ratated file was gone. Not just inaccessible, but completely erased from the directory, as if it had never existed. It was a clean, surgical removal, far beyond any standard file deletion protocol. The experience left me deeply shaken. It wasn't just the fear of discovery and permanent reassignment. It was the nature of the system's response. The static, the noise, the fleeting, horrifying images. It wasn't a standard security measure. It was a defense mechanism, raw and visceral, as if I had poked something ancient and terrible, and it had snarled back at me. What kind of information required such a violent, almost sentient form of protection? The incident also brought a new, more personal fear. Had they noticed? Was my transgression logged somewhere, waiting to be acted upon? Ms. Albright's impassive face floated in my memory. The thought of being escorted away, like Dr. Thorne, into the facility's unknown depths was a constant, gnawing anxiety. A few days later, another rule was disseminated, this one delivered on a physical, blood-red card slipped under our living quarter doors during the night. Cycle. Rule 17T. If you encounter personnel exhibiting extreme pallor, dilated pupils, and a repetitive, soft-clicking vocalization, do not engage. Retreat to the nearest designated safe zone and report via emergency channel. Do not, under any circumstances, allow them to touch you. The specificity of it was terrifying. Extreme pallor, dilated pupils, a repetitive, soft-clicking vocalization. This wasn't a hypothetical scenario. This was a description of something they had encountered, something they expected us to encounter. The term safe zone was also new, implying that some areas of the facility were, by definition, unsafe. The red card itself felt like an omen, a stark departure from the usual sterile, digital dissemination of rules. It felt urgent, almost desperate. I began to see the other personnel differently. The quiet, insular scientists and technicians I worked alongside were any of them close to exhibiting these symptoms. Was the pressure of this place, the constant exposure to the unknown, slowly changing us? I found myself scrutinizing faces in the mess hall, listening for faint clicking sounds in the quiet corridors. The paranoia was no longer a vague unease. It was a sharp, specific fear, a constant companion. The facility was not just a place of strange rules. It was a crucible, and I was beginning to fear what was being fought within its walls and within its inhabitants. The line between observer and subject was becoming terrifyingly blurred. The red card-bearing Rule 17 became a talisman of dread. I kept it in my pocket, its sharp corners a constant reminder. The description of the afflicted personnel was so vivid, so clinically precise, that it felt less like a warning and more like an inevitable future. My observations of my colleagues intensified, bordering on obsession. Every pale complexion, every slightly too wide stare, every nervous tick sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The mess hall, once a place of bland neutrality, now felt like a gallery of potential horrors. Was the man across the table, the one who hadn't touched his food and whose eyes seemed fixed on some distant point, merely tired? Or was he changing? The safe zones mentioned in Rule 17 began to appear on the facility schematics, accessible via our terminals. They were small, reinforced rooms, often located near major junctions or critical labs, marked with a simple green circle. Their sudden designation implied a growing instability, a tacit admission that containment, whatever it was they were containing, was becoming precarious. The facility's veneer of sterile control was cracking, and something was seeping through. My work, ironically, became my only refuge, the complex datasets a welcome distraction from the mounting fear. I was tasked with analyzing a new series of NG signatures, these ones originating not from deep space or beneath the facility, but seemingly from within the very fabric of the building itself. They were erratic, almost spastic bursts, correlating with localized temperature, drops and strange, short-lived magnetic anomalies. It felt like the building was having seizures. I dutifully logged the data, noting the increasing frequency and intensity. But the reports, as always, vanished into the digital ether without comment. One evening, as I was walking from my lab module to my quarters, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic clicking, like fingernails tapping softly on a hard surface. It was coming from a side corridor, one I rarely used, designated Sector 4, Delta, an area I knew housed some of the older, less used biological research labs. My heart hammered against my ribs. Rule 17. Common sense, every instinct for self-preservation, screamed at me to turn around, to retreat to the nearest safe zone, to report. But a morbid, almost irresistible compulsion drew me forward. I had to see. I had to know if the horrors described on that red card were real. Moving with a caution I hadn't known I possessed, I edged towards the intersection. Peeking around the corner, my breath caught in my throat. Standing in the middle of the dimly lit corridor, facing away from me, was a figure in a standard facility jumpsuit. Even from the back, there was something profoundly wrong. The posture was stiff, unnatural, the head tilted at an odd angle. And the clicking, it was definitely coming from this person. A soft, wet, chitinous sound emanating from their throat. As I watched, frozen in a mixture of terror and fascination, the figure slowly turned. It was Dr. Albright, or rather, what had been Ms. Albright. Her normally severe, controlled features were distorted into a grotesque parody. Her skin was stretched taut over her skull, possessing a waxy, corpse-like pallor. Her eyes, those cold, assessing eyes that had so unnerved me during my orientation, were now massively dilated. The irises almost entirely consumed by the blackness of her pupils, reflecting the dim corridor light with a flat, dead sheen. Her mouth was slightly open, and from it issued the relentless, soft clicking, a sound that seemed to burrow directly into my brain. She hadn't seen me. Her gaze was unfocused, directed towards the far end of the corridor. Her hands, held stiffly at her sides, twitched, her fingers clenching and unclenching in a spidery rhythm. There was an aura of profound wrongness about her, a sense that the human being I knew had been hollowed out and replaced by something utterly alien. Rule 17th: do not engage. Retreat. Do not, under any circumstances, allow them to touch you. The words were a lifeline. I began to back away, slowly, silently, my eyes still fixed on the horrifying tableau. But then, as if sensing my presence, her head snapped towards me. The movement was too fast, too jerky to be human. Those vast, black eyes locked onto mine. There was no recognition in them, no flicker of the stern administrator I knew. There was only a cold, predatory emptiness. The clicking intensified, grew louder, more urgent, and then she moved. Not walking, but lurching, her limbs moving with a disjointed, puppet-like gait, yet with an unnerving speed. She was coming towards me. Panic, stark and absolute, finally broke through my horrified paralysis. I turned and fled, my boots pounding on the concrete floor, the sound echoing in the sterile corridors. I didn't dare look back. The clicking sound pursued me, seeming to grow closer with every step. I could hear her ragged, gasping breaths, punctuated by those awful, wet clicks. I fumbled for my access card, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold it. The nearest safe zone was 2 corridors away. It felt like an eternity. The hiss of an opening door behind me told me she was gaining. I risked a glance over my shoulder. She was closer than I thought. Her pale face a distorted mask of hunger. One hand outstretched, her fingers tipped with what looked like sharpened, discolored nails. I reached the safe zone door, slammed my card against the reader. The light flashed green. The heavy door hissed open. I threw myself inside, mashing the emergency lock button on the interior panel. The door slammed shut with a heavy, reassuring thud, just as her pale hand slapped against the reinforced viewport. I collapsed against the far wall, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. Through the small, thick window, I could see her. Her face was pressed against the glass, her features contorted, those black eyes staring in. The clicking was a frantic, desperate rhythm against the viewport. She clawed at the door, her sharpened nails screeching against the metal, leaving faint white scratches. Then, as abruptly as it began, she stopped. Her head tilted, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. After a moment, she turned and lurched back down the corridor, the clicking sound slowly fading into the distance. I stayed in that safe zone for what felt like hours, until the day cycle began and the corridor lights brightened. I reported the incident via the emergency channel, my voice hoarse and trembling. The response was a terse, automated acknowledgement. No one came. No questions were asked. It was as if encountering a clicking, transformed. Ms. Albright was just another operational hazard in this godforsaken place. The encounter shattered the last vestiges of my denial. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were desperate measures against a tide of encroaching horror. The facility wasn't just studying the unknown. It was actively, and perhaps losing, a battle against it. And the personnel, myself included, were not just employees. We were bait, or worse, potential incubators. The cracks in reality were widening, and I could feel myself slipping. The data I analyzed, the strange energy signatures, the whispers from the vents, the redacted reports, the clicking horrors in the connected, a tapestry of madness woven into the very foundations of this place. I didn't know what the ultimate purpose of this facility was, or what lay at its heart. But I knew one thing with chilling certainty. I had to get out. The alternative was to become another rule, another red card warning, for the next unfortunate soul to be fed into the maw of the Nevada desert. I fear these may be my final coherent entries. The clicking has started to sound familiar.